Hello and welcome. In this video, we are going to take a look at HTML forms, or rather an introduction to HTML forms. This video is part of a larger series of videos that focuses on HTML, CSS, client, and server-side scripting. Now, specifically in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to set up your first HTML form. We're going to add a couple of labels to it, a couple of text boxes, and a button. Nothing fancy. We're not really going to do any scripting in this video. Instead, what we're going to do is just focus on the structure of the form and how it relates to other resources on your web server. Now, to begin with, you can just simply grab a screenshot of what I have here, the layout. This just sort of gives you a vision of what's in my mind. And you can also go to the HTML forms resource on the W3 Schools. We're going to be doing our example slightly different than the one that they have, again, just to simply get you started. But fundamentally, what we want to do is we want to create a HTML page with, again, our two labels, two text boxes, and a button for the purposes of collecting information. Now, again, there are a couple of different ways that you can go about doing this. We can talk about how to do this with JavaScript solely, but HTML forms provides you with a very convenient way for collecting information from the user and then sending it to a web server, or if you want to think of it as interacting with another resource on your web server. So let's go ahead and start by creating a new HTML page. And to keep consistent with some of our earlier videos, I'm going to just simply call this one collect_02. We did a collect_01 in another video, and we'll probably have a whole series of these collect HTML pages as we go along. And then let's go ahead and save it. Go ahead and put it in my Apache htdocs folder, even though technically we will not be using my Apache server. And again, I'm just going to call this one collect_02. Now, in the body, in our previous video, we just started by inserting some labels and some inputs. This time around, though, what we're going to do is we're going to leverage the form element. And I'm just going to go ahead and open and close those tags just to go ahead and get started. And I'm going to do something a little strange to begin with, just so you could sort of appreciate both the functionality and the structure of a form. And that what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and start by giving it some style. And again, I'm going to do these just in line to keep this one simple. This part is technically optional. Again, I'm just trying to give you a visual of how a form looks and behaves on a page. Do both of them. And so what we're going to do is we're simply going to add a border. And again, you could play around with it. I'm just going to use a double border. And we'll come back to the rest of the attributes in this video and then also in later videos, what you would consider adding. Now, the rest of this is fairly similar from before. As a matter of fact, you can go ahead and go borrow some of that code if you'd like. And I'm going to start off with a label. And specifically, I'm going to attach that label to those text boxes. And so you want to sort of anticipate what you're going to call those text boxes or create those text boxes first, in that you want to be able to match the ID in the for the label to the ID of the text box. So here, what we want to do is we simply want to call this one perhaps first name underscore text. That will ultimately be my ID. And then we can simply go ahead and add whatever text we'd like to have for that label. Likewise, we'll do the input, and we want to specify the type of the input as text for the first name. The ID then needs to match what we had earlier. So first name underscore text. And again, you could argue that these are probably some pretty bad IDs. In other words, a little long-winded. And as you get further in your development experience, you may choose to use a different pattern. But we also want to have the name attribute. And this time, the name attribute is not optional. In other words, it's actually the key to making your HTML forms work. What happens is when you click submit on this form, it pulls out those values that are identified by name and simply passes them as parameters to the requested resource. And we've still got a few pieces to put together here, and this will hopefully all make sense when we get done. But this time around, the name attributes are essential. The last attribute that we could put in is the value. And again, that we're just going to set to an empty string that is technically optional, but we're going to follow this up with a new line. And then we're sort of going to repeat the process here with the email. So again, I need to think a little bit about what ID I'm going to get in my email field. So this is going to be email underscore text. I seem to have made a little bit of a mess of that. There we go. And then email colon, and then we're going to follow this up with an input type. And for a little bit of variety here, we can go ahead and use the email as the type. In the earlier video, we used the text. Again, we were playing around with some validation. Each of them has some advantages. Then we have our ID equal to email underscore text. Again, whatever you call it, it just needs to match what you have in the for label. And then we have to specify the name. And again, this time I'm going to specify it as email. And then lastly, an optional value. We're going to follow this up again with another new line. And then the last element that we care about is going to be the submit button. And so just like before, we're going to go ahead and specify an input, but under the type, instead of just using a button, we're going to use a special button. We're going to use the submit button. Now, again, we're not going to do any validation in this particular examples. There are other things that we could do. So we're just going to leave this alone. We can go back and style it, for instance. That part probably wouldn't be a bad idea here. So what we'll do is we'll just specify then the background color. And I cannot quite remember what we used in our last videos, but we'll just pick something that looks reasonably decent. And at this point, we're almost ready to go, because we have one more thing we want to do, and that is we want to identify the behavior that we want to have happen when we click on the submit button. Now, again, this is very similar kind of to what we did in the earlier video with the JavaScript, in that we had a type button, and then we used an on-click event, or rather we responded to the on-click event by having some JavaScript that would run for the purposes of validation or for a counter or for any number of other reasons. So the submit button is kind of the same way, okay? The difference being is that it uses an external resource that is identified in the form. And so to accomplish that, we simply go up to the form and we specify the action that we wish to take when the submit button is clicked. And again, it's probably a little counterintuitive to begin with, but you'll get pretty comfortable with this the more that you use the HTML forms. Now, I do want to point out this is technically not the only way that you can go about doing this. This is just a feature that is offered with HTML forms. And so what we want to do is we want to specify what action or what resource do we want to call. And so what we're going to do is we're simply going to create another resource. I'm going to call this one process underscore o2.html. And again, I'm going to emphasize in this video, we're not going to do much scripting or anything like that. We're not even going to start our Apache web server. So all we want to do is have some sort of valid resource that will respond when we click the submit button. And then the last thing that we want to do is we want to specify the method. The default method for a submit button on a form will be a get. And what we're going to do is we're simply going to re-emphasize that. You could, again, technically not mention the method. However, though, we want to be explicit in our example here. So let's go ahead and save this one. And then before we forget, let's go and create another HTML page. We're going to just go ahead and title this one much the same way as we did the other ones. So process underscore O2. And I'm just going to put a message here in the body, something like congratulations on your submission. In other words, just some text so that when we call this page, then we have something to notice, something for us to see so that we know that there's actually a response. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and save this one. I'm going to call this one process underscore O2. And then the other thing to emphasize before we actually run this example is that we have all of this on the file system. We do not have our Apache web server running. As a matter of fact, in a later video, I'm going to sort of do a comparison and the contrast of those two, so you can sort of see what will and won't work without the Apache web server running. But for right now, all we're going to do is we're simply going to click on our collect_02, and you can see that there is my nicely styled HTML page with a form. Of course, I'm slightly joking on this, but you can see here there's my first name field, my email field, and a submit button. And what I'd like to do is I simply want to populate this. We'll go ahead and put in my gmyers@uab.edu, and I click submit. And you'll notice that we now get the response back. Congratulations on your submission. Now, that part isn't really the interesting part. The interesting part is, if you'll notice up in the address bar of your web browser, that we now have the local path to the process_02.html, followed by a question mark and the parameters that were passed from the collect_02 form. If you notice very carefully, we have a first name, which matches, of course, the name of that first text field, and email, which matches the name of that second text field. And then separating the name of the field with the value in that field is simply an equal sign. So what your form is doing on submission is essentially capturing all of the name fields, all of the values out of the name field, passing it to, later on, you'll see your web server, but in this case, it's just appending it to the URL, to the resource specified in the action portion of the form. You'll also notice that the additional arguments are simply delimited by an ampersand. You can see here where my mouse is. You have an ampersand separating first name equal to Gregory and email equal to G. Myers. You'll also notice this %40. Well, that's just simply the way that we pass the address, or the @ rather, the gmyers@uab.edu. We can cover how to handle some of those special characters in a later video. Now, again, we have no validation or anything like that in this particular example. This HTML page isn't really doing anything. As a matter of fact, if you come over here real quick, you can simply specify in a new browser tab by double clicking on the process_02.html. It's not doing anything. It's not doing anything with those additional arguments. Again, we'll cover that in a later video. The key thing to note, though, is that we have now successfully built a form. We've pulled the information off the form, and we've attempted to pass it to another resource. Now, that's about all I've got for this video. I kind of want to break these examples up into some smaller videos so that you can go through and try individual pieces, and then we'll put them back together in subsequent videos. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And thank you for watching.